Wanted to make a quick video here about the visiting US senators to Hong Kong and how ridiculous it is to have them virtue signal the Hong Kong government about freedoms. Ignoring for a second how counterintuitive it is to imagine that a US senator can visit Hong Kong, be allowed entry, roam the streets, meet with protesters and rioters and cheer them on, to then go back and say that Hong Kong lacks basic freedoms is already mind-numbingly obvious that it's completely false. Putting that aside for a second, it's also pretty remarkable what they're saying about police brutality. Having a politician travel from somewhere where they have one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, nearly 6 times that of Hong Kong, and whose police force kills nearly 1,000 people per year, on an ordinary year no less. Having them come to Hong Kong that has been in a state of violence and terrorism for months, for a large portion of this year, where the police haven't even killed a single person, is the perfect example to try to explain the word hypocrisy to somebody. To then have those senators go back and write legislation for Hong Kong. I mean, where they get the right to even begin writing legislation from Hong Kong, I don't know, but that's not something I'm going to get into too much detail here. But I will tell you that this legislation is called the Human Rights and Democracy Act. I should say so-called Human Rights and Democracy Act, where it's designed to audit Hong Kong on an annual basis to make sure that they are sufficiently autonomous, while at the same time they're asking Hong Kong to adopt US foreign export policy and all of the sanctions that they have on foreign countries and people. That's the absolute opposite of autonomy. And the penalty for non-compliance is having the city sanctioned. Yes, this is what the protesters are cheering for. I mean, it should be pretty self-evident that they don't mind destroying their own city, but sanctioning themselves? I mean, there are places that would die to have sanctions removed from their country. No, correction, who are dying because of sanctions. And here you have a group of people who are cheering it on. And these are the people who think that they're fit to run this city. You can also think for a moment, if Hong Kong really was sanctioned and separated from the rest of the world, who are they going to actually have to rely on more? So that's another layer of actually being counterproductive to this idea of becoming more autonomous. There's so many more things I can get into on the Human Rights and Democracy Act, but that deserves a whole video of its own, and I will probably do that. Back to the original point. Could you imagine for a moment if Beijing had sent officials over to New York's Occupy Wall Street protests in 2011 to support the protests, cheer them on, invite some of them back over to Beijing for a chat, and write some legislation for them? Could you imagine what the reaction would have been? So the US thinks that they're an authority on this topic because they're some sort of a beacon of freedom. And that's a point that I'm going to get back to in a second. But based on that logic, could Beijing have argued that they could have got involved in Occupy Central protests? Well, as a matter of fact, using the same logic, they could have. Occupy Wall Street was about the wealth gap, the widening wealth gap in America. And recently it even reached its highest point in the past 50 years. Whereas in China, it's the opposite. Over the last 10 years, they have substantially reduced their wealth gap, and it's now lower than America's. They didn't get involved, did they? And they're not getting involved in Hawaii's protests, which are calling for independence right now either, for a geopolitical or any other reason for that matter. But can you imagine if they did, what would the reaction of the American people, the American media, and the American government be? Wouldn't be very good. But they're okay with it working the other way around. Even if America was an authority on freedom, I've already illustrated to you with this Occupy Wall Street example, it still wouldn't be considered acceptable the other way around. But the fact is, America is not an authority on freedom. According to the Human Freedom Index, Hong Kong is the 3rd freest place on earth, according to tangible, measurable freedoms. And the US, 17th. Yes, number 17 is coming to save number 3. Now, this is not some sort of a pro-China report. It's from the Cato Institute, and in fact, it dedicates a large portion of its report to China bashing. But it's based on actual data, unlike some of these other reports like the World Press Freedom Index, which is based on opinion and surveys rather than actual data. Now, I will say, probably the next time they do this report, we will see a drop because they take into consideration incarceration numbers and all this kind of stuff. And as a matter of fact, we saw the same kind of thing happen during the Occupy Central protests. Before that, they were actually in the number 2 spot. So this is another example of seeing protesters slowly destroy their city, not only physically, but in the rankings now as well. For someone to come here and convince a people who have a lower incarceration rate, less police brutality, longest life expectancies on Earth, one of the lowest infant mortality rates, virtually free healthcare, and paying some of the lowest tax rates in the world, that you're an authority on what they need and that you have a better way for them, requires a lot of convincing. We do already know that the CIA has been funding organizations in Hong Kong through their NGOs like the NED and the CID, and this includes university programs, faculty of law, media. This is all on record. And we can even have a listen to what Michael Pillsbury has to say. Michael Pillsbury is a former Reagan administration official and the current director of the Center on Chinese Strategy in Washington, D.C.
Chinese pro-democracy demonstrators have taken to the streets in Hong Kong, and the Chinese media, state-owned media, has said that it's all the fault of the Americans. Joining us now to make some sense of this is Dr. Michael Pillsbury, a senior fellow of the Hudson Institute and former Reagan administration official. Thanks for joining us. So what do you think? It's all the Americans' fault?
It's not all our fault, but we're partially involved. We have a large consulate there that's in charge with taking care of the Hong Kong Policy Act passed by Congress to ensure democracy in Hong Kong. We also have funded millions of dollars of programs through the National Endowment for Democracy to help democracy in Hong Kong. So in that sense, the Chinese accusation is not totally false.
So only millions of dollars is probably a gross understatement if you combine all of their efforts in Hong Kong together. But the thing is why would you have to spend this much money if this is supposed to be self-evident to the Hong Kong people that their lives are so terrible in Hong Kong? This issue on funding and how deep it goes is another entirely different topic that I'll have to probably do another video on. I want to leave you with one last video of Josh Hawley. It's a new video that he posted on his Twitter. He's one of the more ironic visiting US senators, not only because every single day he's posting the most ridiculous things you could think of saying about Hong Kong, but because he's been one of these guys that's been very vocal on calling Hong Kong a supposed police state. And it's ironic because he is the senator of Missouri. I don't know if you know much about Missouri, but have a look online about how they handled their protests in a small town of Ferguson, with full military vehicles, equipment, and all. Furthermore, you can check out when he was the Attorney General of Missouri in 2017, what he said about his own protesters, that he would not tolerate any violence from them, and that the police would have his full support to prosecute them. It's quite a little bit different from what he's saying about these protesters in Hong Kong, isn't it? On to his latest video, which he posted while talking about Hong Kong, and I must say it actually is one of the most honest videos he has posted so far. And it's an important video to watch, especially if you are a naive Hong Konger who just thinks this is a nice guy helping out.
And to preserve the American nation means to preserve the security and prosperity of this American middle. This imperative forms the basis of our interests in the world. We seek an international order where we can practice our unique way of democracy. We seek an international order that will allow our working people to prosper and to maintain their political and economic independence. And of course, we seek an order where the country our people call home is physically safe and physically secure.
This is, of course, a geopolitical issue for him. He could care less about the Hong Kong protesters. The most important things for him is that he preserves America's power, that other countries do things not autonomously, but America's way, and that everything he does needs to directly benefit the prosperity of his own people. This stuff is, of course, obvious to anyone with half a brain, but just in case you have less than half a brain, I hope that by spelling out this clear conflict of interest, it will help enlighten you to a certain degree. One final thought I want to leave with you guys is what happens when helping Hong Kong is no longer of interest or benefit to the US government. And I hope everybody's already informed enough to know what usually does happen, but if you're not, you can do a pretty easy search online to see what does usually happen when a country or a people's, as we've seen most recently, outlives its usefulness to the US government. And that's a question that any protester who's asking for intervention from the US should be thinking about. On that note, I'm going to leave it here, and I'll see you guys next time.